Go ahead.
Thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity. I too recognize and acknowledge that Hamilton is located on lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement and the traditional territory and waters of diverse First Nations, including those nations' Two-Spirit people. The Ontario Human Rights Code has enshrined grounds upon which it is prohibited to discriminate against people based on gender identity and expression. I'm speaking here to show my support for the implementation of the proposed transgender and gender non-conforming protocol. I transitioned while working at the City of Hamilton a few years ago. My experience was largely positive. I had supportive co-workers and I have a lot of education, giving me the voice and the privilege to stand up for myself and other trans people when facing discrimination or exclusion. I spent most of my time advocating for the rights of marginalized people to have access to safe, affordable, and sustainable housing. I am also very much involved, along with other trans Hamiltonians, with also over 20 doctors, nurses, social workers, and pharmacists in building Hamilton's capacity to deliver evidence-based, accessible healthcare to trans Hamiltonians. Trans people are contributing their skills, commitment, and passion, uncompensated, which I'd like to echo Michelle Poirier, to helping make Hamilton a great place to live, work, and play for everyone. While I was working at the city, I worked with everyone experiencing barriers to housing and healthcare, regardless of gender identity. Something I learned very quickly is that our system is set up to privilege those who fit neatly within the status quo: white, middle class, heterosexual, cisgender, and to marginalize those people whose gender identity or sexual orientation or cultural identity or mental health is other than those of members of the dominant group. We're hearing many statistics illustrating the struggles of trans people face in Canada today, so I won't spend too much time going over them. But one stat that has always stood out for me is the one that tells us that 2/3 of trans people in Ontario have ever avoided a public place 3 or more times because of fear of violence or being read as trans. A public place is the grocery store, the bus, the sidewalk, the hallway outside your apartment, the public washroom. I know at least one trans woman who was too uncomfortable to come to City Hall today to join us. I've never read about anyone being threatened or terrorized by a trans woman in a public washroom, yet I have heard many stories of trans people being terrorized by cisgender people when using a public washroom. Trans women are women, period. Not female, not trans, not gender non-conforming. Trans women are women. Almost 10 years ago, I volunteered my time to work with others to develop the Hamilton West District School Board's equity policy on their steering committee to create a policy that would protect LGBTQ students from bullying, harassment, and exclusion while at school. In those days, one of the same groups that is here today to appeal to the worst instincts of City Council and encourage you to fail to carry out your duty to pass this protocol, warned the board that protecting children against homophobia would undoubtedly open up schools to child abusers, gay recruiters, and who knows what else. History has proven these dire warnings were devoid of evidence or merit. Trans rights are human rights. Everyone has the right in Canada to access public services. As an educator, I urge you to help educate those who are fueled by ignorance, hate, and stubborn refusal to be moved by the overwhelming evidence that trans people are just people, by refusing to believe ideological rhetoric that has been over and over again debunked by the most basic evidence. I call on the City of Hamilton to act in a way that shows solidarity with trans people. I think that there's a lot of solidarity in this room today, and I feel it from City Council as well. Make efforts to hire trans people to work at the City. I also call on the City to provide funding to Trans Day of Remembrance, where trans people gather to remember those who we have lost through transphobia and trans hatred. While developing the policy, the City must consult with trans communities for input about how trans lives will be affected. And finally, commit to a robust and sustainable training plan developed and delivered by trans facilitators for all City councillors and employees. This is a great day for solidarity in the City of Hamilton, and I hope you make the right choice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cole. Sorry, Cole, if I may. Sorry. Councillor Green.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Through you to Cole. Cole, you mentioned the Trans Day of Remembrance. And I'm wondering if you might just want to comment on kind of what that means locally or nationally, statistically, as it relates to murders and or suicides, tragic losses of lives.
Yes, we know because of discrimination, transphobia, trans hatred, that trans people are overrepresented amongst people who are attacked and murdered on a regular basis. I just heard that in the US, in the first 2 months of this year, 7 trans women of color have been killed for being trans. So trans women, especially trans women, but also trans men and gender non-binary people, face inordinate amounts of danger, worries about safety. Even, people won't even leave their apartments for fear of being attacked. So Trans Day of Remembrance is our way of getting together and remembering those people and vowing to further the rights of trans people to live with dignity and without fear in the City of Hamilton and in the rest of the world.
Just as a follow-up question to that, we heard a previous presenter talk about Hamilton being the best place to raise a child. Is it your opinion that trans youth are susceptible to a higher level of suicide and self-harm in that regard?
It's not just my opinion, there's evidence out there that it's actually true. The TransPulse study from Ontario said that on a daily and weekly basis, students in high schools hear 23% of trans students have heard negative talk about trans people from their teachers. So we have teachers who are, it's supposed to be, educating our youth and protecting our youth from danger and discrimination. Also, most teachers don't do this, but there are many teachers who do it. And there is, then you think, well, if there are teachers out there who agree with the lack of rights for trans people, then that means that when bullying and hatred and violence happens in schools or outside of schools with youth, that it's going to be sanctioned, it's going to be okay. We do know that trans youth are much more susceptible to suicide because of family breakdown, being kicked out, lack of resources, etc.
Thank you just for providing some of those statistics, and I'm certainly curious for any other additional speakers who might have the causal impacts of some bad policy as it relates to our kids, because oftentimes, Madam Chair, children are brought forward in defense of this, and I think what sometimes is left is the impact, disproportionate impact that it has on children who grow up, facing some of these bad policies that need to be addressed and reformed, as we are, looking forward to do here today.
I would just say one more thing, that young people are very smart and are very open to, learning. And I think that we do a disservice to children when we say that children are running around being fearful of trans women as well.
If I could, just one more question on that, because I've been struggling with this again, Colin, and I know that your work in the city has been fantastic. We're hearing lots of stuff about, this traumatizing experience of children in public washrooms. Is it safe to say that currently, without this policy, there are trans people who are engaging in public washrooms already, currently?
Yes, yeah.
And so what strikes me is that I've yet to hear an anecdotal, specific example by anybody presented that they've actually had that encounter and it was a traumatic one. So this hypothetical, what I would call the straw man, and I say straw man in a gender-specific way, is one that's interesting, because I've yet to hear of anybody coming in directly impacted with their child to say, I had this experience. Would it be your assertion, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, that when trans people are in public, they make almost every effort to go above and beyond to not subject themselves to the violence in these situations? And so would you just care to comment and elaborate on that?
Well, I just want to say that there is no documented evidence ever of a trans woman attacking a child or a woman in a public washroom. But yet, as Michelle Poirier said, there are legions of, there's loads of evidence out there, anecdotally and documented, of trans women especially being attacked in washrooms. Trans men are attacked as well. And so there's lots and lots of evidence that trans people are vulnerable and are being subjected to violence in public spaces, whereas the argument that is overriding saying that trans women are actually a threat is it has no water, no basis in evidence whatsoever.
Just an interesting follow-up to that. In fact, a previous presenter actually presented that it's the cisgender men who are perpetrating the violence. Do you have any recommendations that might help prevent attacks from cisgender men in these situations?
I think definitely, our judicial system needs to respond to violence against women, in very wholehearted ways. We have organizations here to help women who have been experienced sexual assault, and there are programs out there for cisgender men, but cisgender heterosexual men, I also want to emphasize that the 95% of perpetrators of violence against women and children are heterosexual cisgender men.
That, for me, is something anecdotally that we would probably all recognize, and in fact, it's been presented here by previous speakers, and yet here we are debating something that actually has no evidentiary standing in terms of its impact or threat. So thank you for bringing those points forward, and I certainly appreciate your work and leadership. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Are there any questions, further questions for Cole? Thank you, Cole.